So let me see if I can share that screen in a way that you can actually see the presentation nicely. Share content, PowerPoint slideshow. Not sure how that looks on your screen.
A bit small.
A bit small. Good. That's not what we're after. So let's try that one more time. And actually, let me do it differently. Let me close presentations and then upload it from my computer. That's probably going to be easier. Apologize for struggling with Teams these days. It's really been giving me a hard time. So let me share my screen. And if all goes well, you should see it a little bit bigger now.
Now it's way better.
Haha, great, isn't it? I still need to find my own presentation in a way. Okay, looks better. Okay, so I have no notion what time it is. It's 5:02. Yes. Okay, so let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining my session on a Friday afternoon. My name is Michael. I am a managing partner at the Collective, which means that I try and manage the bunch of misfits that we are. First of all, but also do a lot of consulting in the area of cybersecurity, which is one of the reasons why I'm talking about Microsoft 365 Defender today. As you may have guessed, I submitted my session proposal ahead of Ignite, which meant that the session title doesn't really reflect the name changes that we've gone through, but the slide deck has been updated and should have all the new namings. I blog a little bit, not as much as I used to, on Inside 365 or vanhybrid.com, but I do focus a lot on the M365 Security for IT Professionals ebook, which you can find at m365securitybook.com. Other than that, sometimes I am a little bit active on Twitter, but you don't really want to follow any of my ramblings. Anyway, what we are here for today, however, is to talk about Microsoft 365 and why I believe it is a wonderful solution and how it is capable of bringing you into the 21st or 22nd century for managing security within your M365 environment and beyond. And we'll cover some of those details in just a bunch of minutes. Obviously, none of this would be possible if, first of all, there wasn't a great virtual event today, and none of it would be possible without the sponsors making events like this possible and an opportunity for you to learn about stuff that is happening, amongst which is M365 Defender and all of its goodness that we are going to talk about. Now, before diving into some of the details around Microsoft 365 Defender, and as you can see, I am practicing the new names. I might slip into threat protection once in a while, and I might name some of the products that kind of fall under M365 Defender by their old name, but I'm trying really, really hard to keep up with marketing. And by the time I'm used to this, they'll probably change the name again, right? Anyway, why are we talking about M365 Defender? Well, first of all, a great product, but why, right? Well, you know, when you take a look at the challenges that we face today, right, in the cybersecurity landscape, then there's plenty of challenges to go about. But things that you should remember are some of the key elements, like, you know, 51% of data breaches are through malicious attacks. That seems not, you know, that seems little compared to the overall number of data breaches. There's a lot of accidental data breaches. Some are purposeful, but not necessarily malicious. But roughly half of the data breaches happened through one or the other malicious attack. And we'll go a little bit deeper into the anatomy of an attack in just a minute. On average, it takes organizations 206 days to realize they've been breached. Let that sink in for a second. 206 days. It used to be worse, right? I think the national number for Belgium was 254 days in 2018. So having an average of 206 days, not knowing that you've been breached is, it's better, but it's not great. It's more than half of a year that someone can be, looking around in your environment, doing damage, and you not knowing it. It's one of the things that we see in a lot of attacks where ransomware is involved, is that the initial entry into the environment happened a long time ago. And because they were active in the environment such a long time, they were able to contaminate even the backups or the backups of the backups, which means that restoring data from a backup doesn't always ensure that you're starting with a clean slate. But there's other challenges as well. There is complexity, which leads to human error, configuration errors, oversights. Which in turn open up your environment with all sorts of vulnerabilities, and therefore can constitute a breach. We see that on a day-to-day basis, that there will be about 3.5 million unfilled vacancies in cybersecurity by 2021. That's obviously it's a number pulled out of thin air, but it shows the amount of vacancies worldwide there will be just with regards to cybersecurity. And I know firsthand, as an organization that does IT security services, for us it's really hard to attract people and to find people with the necessary skills, because security goes really, really broad. And then on top of that, we have the benefit or the downside of having to work with Microsoft. And what do I mean with downside or upside? The good thing is we get lots of great technology to work with that better our productivity or security and so forth and so on. But it also is one of the most targeted platforms, whether it's Windows or Office. A lot of the attacks try to exploit vulnerabilities, and about 74% of them try to, of the attacks don't just leverage human behavior. They will actually actively exploit Windows security breaches or vulnerabilities or Office and so forth and so on. So as you can see, there's a lot of reasons why IT security, cybersecurity really matters. And what we're going to talk about today is how Microsoft 365 Defender can actually help you overcome some of these challenges. No, it won't help you attract people to work for you, or skills people to work for you, but at least it can take away some of the work that you are dealing with, so that perhaps you can do more with the same amount of people you have today. And again, running a SOC, right, a Security Operations Center as a service for our customers, we see that leveraging technologies like M365 Defender and its components actually allows us to win a lot of time, and therefore spend less time troubleshooting something, investigating something. As such, 1 and 1 is 2. We have more time to do other stuff, therefore we theoretically require less people and so forth and so on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what does an attack look like, right? And there is 1,000,001 ways that your organization could be attacked. It depends on the solutions you use, what the attackers are after, whether it's a drive-by attack, whether it's a script kiddie that just launched whatever they wanted to do, whether an endpoint of yours was found open on the internet and someone's trying to exploit it just because they can, or they want to go after your crown jewels. Literally go after the data that you're known for, that provides you your business value, or your cutting edge over your competitors. It doesn't really matter, right? So what you can see here on screen is basically the anatomy of a complex attack. And I said complex, or I stated complex in between brackets, because this is not that complex. It looks complex because there's lots of little things that come into play, and there's different avenues that can be taken, right? It always starts with an attacker, accidental, purposefully, doesn't really matter, right? And they will typically, research a little bit their target. So let's assume for a second that you're actively being targeted. So you're not collateral damage, you are the target, right? People want to get data from your environment. Then the attacker will start by looking into, what are you doing on the internet? What systems are you using? What information can they find out about you and your systems looking on the internet? So they will monitor some of the social media of your employees, more notably the ones working in IT. They might be skimming blog posts to reveal, some data screenshots that contain information about the systems that you're using. Because of the open community that we live in, people tend to overshare a lot of information. Now, don't get that badly, right? I love sharing information, and I think people should do that because other people can continue to learn from it. But also realize that once you are sharing stuff in a session like this on, hey, we're using Windows 10, we've just implemented XYZ, we've got these and these things running, that's great. Well, you've just given away your entire infrastructure. Well, not the details, but now people know that you're using Windows 10. Great. Well, chances were 99.9% anyway. But you've also given away which security products that you're using. Maybe you've detailed a little bit about which configuration items you have, and it just makes things a little easier for an attacker. It doesn't mean that without the information they wouldn't be able to go ahead. They would still, but you just made it a little easier. It's not just that. It's also all the other stuff that you're releasing on social media. For instance, hey, our entire organization is going to have a day off on Christmas. No one will be working because we love Christmas. Great. Well, you just told an attacker that on the 24th in the evening, it would be a great time to launch an attack because probably on the 25th, no one will be monitoring the systems. Obviously, these are things that they can understand from the context or the country that you're in, and most organizations don't work on the 25th of December or even on New Year's Day. It doesn't really matter. It's not horrible that people find out that information because they can find it out in a different way, but don't just put it out there. Also, GitHub, great. You should be surprised by how many organizations are using a public GitHub repository, pushing their code in there, and forget to scrub the code for secrets, keys, and so forth and so on. So an attacker will scrub these GitHub repositories from your employees, your company, and try and get code and hopefully find key material in that code that they can use to gain access to your environment. And obviously, if there is any key material in there, whether it's a password or a certificate or an API key, it just makes getting into your environment a lot easier, right? And then from there, there's different things that can happen. The most common way of gaining access into the environment today is by far sending out a phishing email. And I wish I could say that we've gotten better at detecting phishing emails, and in a way we have, but it's a moving target as new or as types of phishing messages are being blocked. The malicious attackers come up with new and new ways of trying to circumvent detection altogether, right? And then detection back in the days was like sending a blank email with just an attachment because a lot of scanners would just pass along the blank email because it didn't contain any data. These are things that don't happen anymore, right? What people are doing these days, and especially very targeted specific attacks, is they will register a domain name for a company that looks like yours, or not even looks like yours, because that is easily caught by message hygiene solutions. Like if I'm company X and you register domain name company XX and then send out an email to me, a lot of the phishing filters will use that as a signal to know, well, this is odd. This is a domain name that looks like yours, isn't really yours, and is sending you a message. Be careful with it. It's kind of what Defender for Office 365 domain protection does, or domain impersonation protection does. But what they will do is they will actually register the domain name of a company elsewhere, maybe a company that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So let's say that I'm company X and I work with company Z. Well, the attackers might actually purchase a domain name called companyzz.com, send you an email hoping that they will trick you into believing it actually came from your business partner. Now, obviously, a double Z at the end is easily caught, but the difference between an I and an L in a domain name is a lot harder to spot. And we've recently seen it with one of our customers where no one figured out that it was a spoofed domain. everyone's like, yeah, this is a legitimate domain. Even after asking them, can you read the domain name? They always said X, and I'm like, no, I've seen this is an L, not an I. And it's only when you change the font or you make it all caps that you can see, oh, right, the I is an L, or vice versa, right? But either way, long story short, phishing emails get to your users, and they're going to try and trick your users into either opening malicious attachment if it wasn't caught by the message hygiene solution, and or there's a link in the email that sends them to a website, which kind of brings us to the exploitation phase, where on the website they download an attachment, which hopefully people open up, right? Whether it's a Word file or an Office file with a macro within, or something that's really popular these days, a zip file with an HTA file in it, where the HTA file will execute something. Now, what we've seen is that there is a lot of differences. Like one of the cases that we've recently had is an HTA file in a zip file. You open up the application, and the application runs pseudocode in the back, which does all sorts of bad stuff to your computer. But at the same time, it opens up a web page that looks legitimate. Right? So the end user has no idea what's happening. They're like, oh, right, I see this website, which looks legitimate. Right, it's an HTA application, and anyone in IT would know, like, this isn't right. The users don't necessarily do that. Well, the goal is not just to open up the website, it's to deceive the users, to run the code, and hopefully that the code itself can then lead to a compromised device. Now, what the code does can be a million and one different things. It could be running a small application. It could be running PowerShell code. It could be downloading secondary payloads onto your machine, which then triggers something else, and so forth and so on. Either way, the goal is to compromise the device, and from there, lots of things can happen, right? Once the device is compromised, if they want to get foothold into your environment to do further bad stuff, then they'll phone home. They'll contact a C2 server. Apologize, I've got a little cold here. But they'll contact the C2 server, a command and control server, basically to get data. It's a reverse shell, which then can be used to instruct that compromised device to start doing several things. Enumerate the domain, try to move laterally across the environment, and this could either be fully automated, or someone could be sitting at the other end at the C2 server or at the console, and literally doing stuff in your environment. And then things can go a little bit different directions, right? Maybe it's just someone that's trying to push a ransomware workload payload into your environment, encrypt all your data, and then ask you for ransom so that they can make some profit off of it. Or perhaps they're just there to snoop around, get your data, and try and steal your data. In which case, once they have a device, it really depends whose device it is. If it's just one of your users in the environment, the chances that they can do a lot of bad stuff with that device is rather low. So they'll start moving laterally between devices, maybe try and escalate their persistence from that one device to a server to multiple servers. Ultimately, the goal is to get to what they call dominance, where they own your domain. And they can own your domain once they have hold of a domain controller or a domain admin account. Needless to say, that is bad. That's really bad. Now, not all scenarios end up with a domain dominance, where your entire domain has been fallen prey to the attackers. Sometimes it's a matter of getting to the right people with the right access, which then grants them access to the sensitive data. And sensitive data doesn't necessarily mean encrypted. It could be anything that is of value to the attacker, anything that's business related, anything that they can sell for a profit, or that they can use to, ask ransom for without even encrypting it. Anything that is of value to you can be of value to the attacker, and then ultimately they can extract the data in a million and one ways, right? They can use the compromised device through that C2 channel to actually upload the data elsewhere. We've seen instances where that compromised device actually opens up a Twitter account and then starts tweeting information in private messages to another account, and those tweets contain the data that is actually the data that they're trying to extract. And the way that they do this is to bypass detection over a C2 channel, because if there's large amounts of data that all at once start being extracted, then that might raise a little bit of suspicion on the networking team, and then doing a message each time with some data in it, even if it's encrypted data or whether it's binary, it doesn't really matter. It can take a long time, but then they can kind of fly under the radar. Needless to say, I've taken about 10 minutes to go through a wide array of different types of attacks and attack avenues. And all of this is just to say that there's so much that can happen. Now, consider your own environment. You know better than anyone else, how many people you have, how many resources you have to try and fight all of this. Now, you could take the approach where you're like, well, you know what? I don't really care. There's nothing that people can steal from me. Well, don't forget that anything that is of value to you, personal or business-wise, can be of value to anyone else. Now, truth be told, there's some organizations that are just a larger target than others, but still, even if it's not for data theft, it could be ransomware. And even in cases of ransomware, what we've seen is that they do encrypt your data, but chances are that they've already copied your data elsewhere. And the first cases of an organization paying ransom, them being decrypted again, just to have another ransom being asked a year or two later for the data that was stolen during the first ransomware attack, are now becoming more and more prevalent. So, either way, ransomware or something else, it's a bad thing that you don't want to happen, but we'll all agree on that. So what is the traditional approach of try and battle all of these things here, right? It's to use point solutions. Point solutions can be a firewall, a really, really, really good firewall, and a really, really good antivirus or endpoint protection solution, or any of the sorts that really excel in what they do. So when we take a look at that, for instance, let's take a look at the discovery and exploitation phase. Then what you can see is that a great firewall or IPS device, they will provide you visibility into the destination IP addresses and where the traffic is coming from. And if you do layer 7 offloading, then you might actually be able to determine what the cloud applications are. If you're not using layer 7 offloading on those devices, then based on the destination IP addresses, you may be able to understand a little bit which cloud applications that they're talking to. So that gives you some visibility into what's happening in your environment, but ask yourself this, right? Let's say that one of your devices was compromised and then all of a sudden it starts talking to an IP address somewhere on the internet, port 80, 443, things that are allowed. Does that necessarily raise suspicion? Well, you could create a rule on your firewall or SIEM solution if you have one that states, well, whenever I see an IP address that I haven't seen before and only a handful of devices are talking to that endpoint, then raise an alert because it could be a new C2 host. Sure, but what if that C2 host is an IP address that is shared? One of the things that we've seen recently is where the use of CDN networks is being used to drop payloads in an environment. Now, I can tell you by looking at the string, the domain name, that you can see, okay, this is a malicious domain name, for instance, but it's pointing to an IP address which is shared with hundreds of other services out there on the internet. So the IP address itself is no longer an indicator, but the domain name is. Well, if you don't do layer 7 offloading, the firewall can really help. So as you can see, it may be able to block certain things, but by itself, it doesn't give you the whole visibility that you could use in order to add some more logic into what's happening. The same is true for how are we going to fight and prevent messages from coming in? Well, obviously, no one's using email these days without a filtering solution. Now, you can buy really, really good filtering solutions, and what will they give you? Well, they will give you attachment protection by detonating them in a sandbox environment. Great. I just sent you a zip file with a password, or a password protected zip file, and in the email, I wrote, this is your password. To my knowledge, and I may be wrong, there's not a single solution out there that would still take the zip file, read the password from the file from the email, and then detonate it in a sandbox. It just isn't done, right? So you can configure your policies not to allow executable content zip files with a password protection and always funnel it through IT. But most organizations that I know that use these point solutions, they will just send it out to you anyway and be like, yeah, well, we couldn't scan the attachment, right? Or they'll add a big warning of be careful, there's an attachment in there that may be malicious, and they'll ask the user to be vigilant about what's happening. Well, imagine, right, that email is coming from a known good email address. Is your first response, well, this is odd. This is a zip file with a password from someone I know? No, human curiosity will take over. In most cases, even in the simulated attacks that we do with our customers, we see that people are like, oh, I know that guy. Who, he sent me a zip file. Let me see what's in the zip file. It's just human nature to be curious about what's happening. So again, you may have specific really good protection in one area, but then it fails to protect you in the things that happen afterwards or things that happened before. In this case, let's say that I've sent a phishing email coming from an IP address that is known to be malicious, right? And it's known to be malicious because your firewall knows about it. Well, how does your message hygiene solution know about it? Perhaps they share the same allow list or block lists, right? Perhaps they don't. Maybe they have the same threat intelligence. Maybe they don't. Maybe your message hygiene solution doesn't even allow for external threat intelligence. You don't know. There is no link between both solutions, or there's no apparent link between both solutions per se. So that, again, leaves you with a lack of visibility. And we can continue. Same goes for endpoint protection. Well, you can have the state-of-the-art endpoint protection, but if it doesn't know what's coming in through email, it doesn't know where the email came from, what systems it touched, who touched it, or where it's going to, what connections it makes. If it doesn't have any access on the network, then you only get a subset of information about the attack, and that it's the metadata of the attack, everything else around the attack, that can make the difference between having an alert, which is meaningless by itself and harmless by itself, versus all the metadata around it that point to that alert being 100% surely malicious. Again, CASB, well, they focus on that piece of cloud applications, right, where we can see what's happening in those cloud applications. It doesn't really care about email necessarily, doesn't care about the endpoints, doesn't even know about the endpoints necessarily, or the network, well, where you're using the public network or the internal network. These are all things that it doesn't necessarily know about. Now, I'm careful using words here. I say doesn't necessarily know what it is about. You can configure all these integrations, right? And this is also one of the challenges that you have with all these great point solutions. First of all, each of these solutions may be creating alerts by themselves and then just throwing them at you, right? Alerts, signals, information. Well, what you get is information overload. What happens if you have an information overload? You're just like, yeah, I'll ignore them. The amount of automatic inbox rules that state, well, if sender is firewall, send it to the junk mail folder or send it to that folder, and then there's like 7,000 email messages in that folder and no one ever looks at it, right? How often does that happen? All too often, and rightfully so, because if there's 7,000 alerts from one solution coming in, then there is no human capable of filtering through those alerts. Now imagine that you've got 7,000 alerts from your firewall or signals from your firewall or whatever it may have detected. Then you've got a couple more hundred from your message hygiene solution, and your endpoint protection is throwing several hundred more at you. Well, at the end of the day, you're just drowning in that data. And even if you don't, let's say that you've been able to trim down the quote unquote false positives. Then you get some data from your firewall, some data from endpoint protection, some data from your message hygiene solution, and now you have to put two and two together, right? Is the alert that we saw on the firewall related to the alert on the endpoint? Or, the endpoint says there was specific code executed, which was detected as being malware, but, did it make a connection to an IP address? And is it related to the alert from the firewall because of the first time the IP address was seen? So what you're going to do is then, take the one alert, take a look at the timestamps, match the timestamps with the firewall, and all of a sudden you're busy trying to connect the dots. You're wasting precious time trying to figure out whether or not the information you have is correlated, is not correlating, or whether it's entirely separate incidents, if it is an incident at all. Now, at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, right, it's a could have, would have, should have scenario. You can have all these solutions and you can probably mix and match them together in one way using APIs, PowerShell scripts, and whatever. I've seen some really beautiful solutions out there of which I immediately thought, wow, greatly built. How many years of your life have you spent building these automations based on PowerShell scripts and whatnot? It's kind of like that's why I used the picture of Raspberry Pi devices where you can basically do anything, but you have to invest a lot of time into making all these things work together. Now go back to my first slide about these challenges. You're resource constrained as it is. Things are difficult as they are. It's a moving target. By the time we've figured out how to block specific behavior, the attackers have figured out something new. And we're not even talking about vulnerabilities that keep popping up month after month after month. And not even on a monthly basis, it's basically on a daily basis. So, it's a wave. That wave is just continuing, and it's never a great idea to focus on things that don't really matter. You shouldn't be focusing on building these integrations. Vendors should be focusing on building those integrations. And this is where I believe the true value of a Microsoft 365 Defender is, right? Looking at that landscape again, at that attack surface that we have and the attack timelines and the attack avenues and the different outcomes and the activities that can happen, well, what do we see, right? Well, we've got Defender for Office 365, previously known as Office ATP, right? Where you've got protection for phishing emails, for basically message hygiene at large. But it doesn't stop there. It provides you the same, or not the same, but similar functionality for Teams and SharePoint Online, because believe it or not, we've seen guest users being abused in another tenant to send messages to someone with a link to a phishing website. So if you don't have any protection on Teams or anything else where a guest account can actually get access to, then you should be a little bit wary about what's happening, right? So this is where Defender for Office 365 provides great flexibility, great protection. Is it the best message hygiene solution in the world? Not necessarily. I think there are some other great solutions as well. It's really good performing, but I wouldn't call it the best. Well, to be honest, there was not a single solution I would call this is the best one. But in light of everything, it is a really good solution, and it has the benefit of being integrated. More about that later. Now look at everything that's happening on the endpoint. Whether your endpoint is Mac or Windows or a server, you've got the Defender for Endpoint, which can see where you're going to through network protection, can see what workloads are being executed, processes, and so forth and so on. It's a really, 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 really solid endpoint protection solution. And it just doesn't stop at protecting, right? It provides you visibility, much needed visibility, and high level of protection, and allows you to be proactive through threat and vulnerability management, right? Which kind of ties in with that exploiting the bugs or preventing bugs from being present on the system and so forth and so on. Let's then continue, right? When I mentioned lateral account movement and privilege escalation, we get into the realm of identity, right? And identity is a large topic. You can have Azure AD, you can have on-prem AD, you've got a hybrid situation. So through Defender for Identity, or previously known as Azure ATP and Azure AD together, you can get a lot of details, a lot of signals, a lot of alerts that provide valuable information about what's happening in your environment. Especially if you have a heavy reliance on the on-premises Active Directory, which is the case for most organizations, then having that visibility to understand what's happening, whether someone's reading your directory to do reconnaissance, or they're passing the hash, or maybe you've been able to trick someone into using your honeypot account. This is the type of information that you as a defender, right? You as a blue teamer really need to have to understand of what's happening in your environment. And then ultimately, and to no surprise, you have Cloudeight Security that can give you the visibility into what's happening in your cloud applications that are connected to Cloudeight Security. What do I mean? Well, you can know, what types of activities that are being executed. You can enable a user entity behavior analytics to understand what is a typical activity that Michael executes, and then once I start doing a typical stuff, you can get alerts. Or if I upload on general 250 kilobytes a day, and once all of a sudden I start uploading 250 megs a day, well, that could be an indicator that something's off. Maybe I'm just, tired of working with you and I'm extracting all my data so I can use it later at a different job, which is, a different type of threat. Or maybe my account was breached and someone's using my privileges, my accounts, my cloud applications to extract data from the environment. So independently, all these solutions provide a lot of visibility. And, it's partially true. It's a partial marketing story. But I'm not marketing. Honestly, I'm not working for Microsoft. I'm someone who sells solutions. And by selling solutions, I don't even sell software. I help people protect their environment from certain things. We run a SOC, as I mentioned. All of the things that I just mentioned here, I have that from a first-hand experience. We've seen attacks where we weren't able to catch the phishing email because they were so bloody darn well crafted. And it's not just Exchange Online Protection or Defender for Office 365. The mail was not caught by 3 or 4 different independent vendors. The assume breach mindset. Just assume that any of the components you have in your environment can and will fail you at some point. Well, luckily, right, the initial defense didn't protect us, but then all of a sudden there was an alert. Out of the blue, Defender came up with an alert, said, this code was running on the device. Okay, great. And then 20 minutes later, Azure ATP or Defender for Identity threw in a different alert and said, well, from that device, we saw this activity. And then correlating both of them together, we knew, oh, this isn't good. We've got a device where something happened that we weren't sure about whether or not it was malicious. And then all of a sudden, that device started doing stuff within the on-premises Active Directory that we know it shouldn't be doing. Well, putting one and one together, immediately, it goes from a potentially malicious activity to a, I'm almost certain it's malicious. Well, fast forward a little bit longer in time, if we wouldn't have blocked that device or isolated that device from the network, I'm pretty sure we would have seen an extraction of data, or maybe even different activities in the on-premises Active Directory to do lateral movement and so forth and so on. So we can see that the information that's coming from independent products together is providing a lot of value. Now, when I say we can see this, then in a point solution environment where you get all these data, then you've got what they call SOC analysts that take a look at data and then try and correlate the information. And some of it is automated through scripting, some of it is through logic, some of it is because you just know it is the case. But you don't want to necessarily spend that time. You don't want to do that. You want to have a system that can immediately tell you, well, you know what? The detachment that was part of that email that was executed on that machine caused this network connection, downloaded that payload, is now trying to do that. And oh, by the way, I go back to my message hygiene solution and I see that the same attachment was delivered to 25 people in your organization. I'll raise you one more. SafeLinks then reports back and tells you 5 of the 20 people that received the attachment actually opened up the attachment or navigated to the phishing website, whatever. Right? You get within a blink of an eye who got the message, when was it delivered, who acted upon it, so you know what the initial size of your breaches or potential breaches. You know what you need to focus on, those 5 users, 5 devices where they will actually clicked on it and maybe they executed something. And why is that important? Because even though you have great endpoint protection, there's still going to be cases where an email came in or a different form of phishing came in, runs code on the device, and runs unnoticed. They don't necessarily escalate privileges right away. They don't necessarily do bad stuff right away, and it isn't always triggered as being bad stuff. We've had cases where connectivity to a C2 server took 6 or 7 days before an alert was raised. You know what? I think it's communicating to a C2 server. And why was that? Is because they did it infrequently. They changed the IP address every couple of days so that, and by they I mean the attackers, because they know that the firewall solution that was in place at that customer had a specific threshold, right? And that threshold, they always tried and steered under. Some of the things that a lot of people that are fairly new to cybersecurity don't realize, or don't always realize, is that successful attackers don't generate these critical alerts. Because if they do, well, they've just blown their cover. They will do that once they've activated the ransomware, then all lights go off all over the place. But successful attackers are in the lows and the informationals and the medium alerts, the ones that you are overwhelmed with nonetheless. Right? And it's from there that you need to be able to correlate efficiently to understand where you need to start putting your effort. And this is what Defender does, right? It does all that automation for you, presents you with let's call it an investigation package, and tells you, this is what I've been able to find. By the way, I blocked it or I didn't. I found this or I didn't. I've been able to correlate this. At least I've saved you a boatload of time. And this is what you need to go after, right? Have that unified experience, have that automation, right? Whether it's automated self-healing, right? The automated investigation or response, whether it's automated coordination of alerts and signals across the different products to present them to you in one incident. This is where the true value of a solution like M365 Defender actually lies. Now, does it stop there, right? Is this where M365 or M365 Defender stops? No. Well, taking a look at where it lives, right? We're going to pull in Azure Sentinel as well. What you see here are 5 phases or activities related to cybersecurity according to NIST. We've got identify, we've got protect, we've got detect, we've got respond, we've got recover. Identify is to identify the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities that happen in your environment. Microsoft 365 Defender through Defender for Endpoint. I'm going to use a lot of Defender here in this session, but through threat and vulnerability management can identify which the weaknesses are on your endpoints. Through Defender AV, attack surface reduction, exploit protection, through all these features, it can keep you safe and protect the endpoints, servers, endpoints, and so forth and so on, even cross operating system. Then there is the detection phase, right? Again, through the EDR components running on the machine, through Defender AV, it can detect when malicious code is being run. It can alert that code. It can surface that into the different solutions. It will post that through the graph and try and correlate that information. And then with Microsoft 365 Defender, you can respond. It will proactively block elements, not just blocking in terms of protecting it, but it will, once it has discovered certain things, it can block certain activities, or it can allow you to trigger playbooks, logic apps. For instance, if I see an alert with priority medium that is correlated or has this title or whatever, right, and the user is there and this happens, you build some logic, you can automatically isolate the device from the network, which allows you to respond with little to no effort. It will not help you recover that device. Well, it may try and clean the device, but that's an entirely different ballgame. It doesn't do anything with backups and so forth and so on. But it covers 4 out of the 5 phases from the NIST cybersecurity framework. And some of it are pre-breach activities, some are post-breach activities. But as you can see, it covers a wide variety of things compared to, for instance, Azure Sentinel. And the reason why I'm adding it here is just to give you is where it focuses on the detection and a response. Sentinel does not protect you from anything, right? It gathers information and it takes information and it can surface that information for you so that you can more easily detect when something's going on in your environment. And it then has a very elaborate SOAR engine, right? Logic apps that you can add on top of Azure Sentinel that can do a lot of other things. Create tickets in Jira, isolate a device, run an investigation, run a scan, do this, do that, block the user account, and so forth and so on. So you can easily build your own logic on top of both products. Now, the quote-unquote benefit that an Azure Sentinel has is that it can do that on top of everything else that is not Microsoft 365. And this is why I like this slide a lot, not just because I created it, but it's also because it kind of shows you where everything lives. Microsoft 365 is great at protecting all your endpoints in your environment, provided they're all enrolled in endpoint, Defender for Endpoint. It gives you the information of where or data about where your information lives. Typically Office 365, especially if you're an M365 customer, right? It tells you about Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and all the other applications. Cloudeight Security gives you visibility not just into Microsoft 365, but also in different other clouds, right? If you connect Google or AWS, but also in all the other applications that you connect to Azure AD and that you connect to Cloudeight Security. That's also one of the really important things here, right? For this to work, you have to be invested. Right? You have to search integration. One of the biggest challenges we have in cybersecurity, but not just cybersecurity and things in general, is lack of visibility. Well, if you connect a cloud application to Azure AD, you immediately get a plethora of data that can help you distinguish signals or alerts being benign or malicious. And it's an easily overlooked benefit where I believe it should be your go-to approach, right? If you have a cloud application, connect it to Azure AD and then immediately put it into Cloudeight Security. And then through the endpoint protection capabilities of Defender, you also fuel Cloudeight Security and you get this richer experience. Top it off with Azure Identity Protection and Defender for Identity, so formerly known as Azure ATP. You get that pure identity view in the on-premises Active Directory, Azure AD Active Directory, and it kind of fuels that into Defender 365, which in its own can do protection, detection, and response. But it can also fuel that information back into Azure Sentinel, right? There's new connectors that allow you to either raise alerts in Azure Sentinel or stream of the data, some of the data in Azure Sentinel, which can then really take in any data, right? Networking device information, pull it into Azure Sentinel. Sure, you can add that same data into Cloudeight Security, but it's an entirely different use case. Cloudeight Security will use the data from your firewall to provide visibility into cloud application usage. It will not necessarily use that for the same use cases as an Azure Sentinel would do, right? And then with information from networking devices, other clouds, Google, Amazon, doesn't really matter, or your own custom-built third-party applications or bot applications, doesn't really matter. You pull in all that data, you pull in all that information, and then you can have a lot of AI, right? User entity behavioral analytics that can run on top of Azure Sentinel. You can build your own ML models. You can try, or not just try, you can actually reason over that data at a scale that is spanning both your M365 environment and the rest of your estate. Ultimately, what you're trying to do by combining both of them together is to provide the investigator, the SOC analyst, with a unified view, an easy way to distinguish what's malicious and what's not, the tools they need to quickly respond and have an overview and leverage the best of both worlds. Now, the beauty of all of this is that 365 Defender can do all of that on its own right. Azure Sentinel can do all of that in its own right, and combined they provide you basically the I'm going to call it the Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Star Trek Enterprise of cybersecurity. Gives you all the tools, all the visibility, and everything you need to be successful in protecting your environment and investigating and responding to the alerts. Because whether you like it or not, protection alone will not make it anymore. You can't just protect your environment and hope for the better. You need to invest into SOC. Well, not into security operations. You need to invest into looking into the alerts, looking into the incidents. And unless you want to be drawn into manually looking into each and every one of the alerts that you get through all the solutions that you have deployed in your environment, you need to do it in a smart way. And the smartest way is to use automation, to use solutions like in Microsoft 365 that's fully integrated, and like Azure Sentinel that gives you the capabilities to build that automation in a very, very easy way, and that allows you to integrate almost natively with so many other platforms that you can actually manage the workload without necessarily have to upskill and upscale your entire IT operations just to be able to face the cybersecurity challenges that we have. And with that being said, I believe that we're about around time of this session. I really hope you've liked it. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and speak up. Other than that, there's a QR code on screen. Please use it to leave feedback about this session. I really hope you've enjoyed it. 45 minutes is really short for such a big topic. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through social or in here. I really appreciate you being here, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.